I think we've heard very, very interesting and rich presentations. And Regina Smyth started by saying that it is easy to be cynical about the situation with the Russian opposition. I would say it is easy to be despondent or even depressed, and this is what we heard from Boris just now. And this is indeed a pervasive perception in the Russian circles who used to be hopeful back only a few years ago. Now, what indeed we heard was fairly rich, and I think that the combination that what we heard in the presentations about the dynamics and the regional legitimacy and the history of the opposition movement, if this is the way we should call it, and I will speak a little bit about that later. The very interesting part of Sam's and Graeme's work about the internet and television and how the preference for one or the other affects public perceptions, as well as this dynamics of the internet exchange on the social networks. I think it's an immense contribution to the understanding of the phenomena of the opposition, that it is a changeable and movable target. And I think that was part of what Sam was talking, and I think it's really, really important because we've seen over these past years quite different manifestations of what may be called protest activity or indeed opposition movement, or in fact, I think because it's such a changeable and movable target, it's really hard to think of one term to apply to it. And I don't think opposition is actually the most apt term to be applied. Also, Graeme's presentation on what factors define the perceptions and agreeability. For some reason, Graeme, you used social acceptance more in your oral presentation, but in the paper it's more agreeability, and I think, do you think it is the same or not? I think it's an interesting question. And factors such as patriotism, etc., that also help us understand the 80+% factor, and indeed the vast, impressive shift in the public perceptions that Graeme also spoke about and that we all know, the difference, the change from 60+% approval rating for Putin to 80+% approval rating. I think the factor of the aspect of history, this very short history and a very rich history of what we call the opposition movement, or however we should call it, which begins in 2011 and in fact earlier than that, is also important to understand what we're dealing with here. And I think that the root cause, or rather the roots of what became the protests and what drove many observers to call it opposition was a rise in civic activism. And there we should go back to at least 2009, 2010, and of course the one of the first and maybe the first climax was 2010 and what happened during the forest fires in Russia. And this is when we realized that what was at play in Russia during the years of Putin's of 10 democracy, of Medvedev's presidency, was actually a process of social modernization. A combination of several factors contributed. It was the relative prosperity. It was very fast penetration of the internet and social networks. It was the, I would say, verbal freedom of the time when Medvedev was president. And also the rise of post-industrial economy in Russia, and all that converged in what I would certainly describe as social modernization in many different ways. And the uninformed infatuation with the West that was the case in the Soviet Union in very late stages of this union gave way to what I would say informed appraisal of what West was about, and then to Westernization. What the social modernization produced, among other things, was a taste for civic activism in quite different forms. And in the paper, in Sam's and Graham's paper, you talk about different kinds of anti-regime activity. I would add that not just anti-regime, all kind of charity and environmentalism and all kinds of other forms of activism. People developed, people of a certain community, I think, Graeme, you called them what, educated urbanites? Okay, this is one way to describe it. They developed this taste, and it was very broadly, became very broadly popular among this constituency to engage in that. And in working on all kinds of projects, they developed a sense of we can. If there's a problem, we'll get at it and we'll solve it. They were individual civic problems, and they were able to solve them. And this is why 2010, when the rescue operation by the public was much more efficient than the eventually, of course, bungled operation, rescue operation of the state. It was the skills of organization, the skills of management, the skills of exchanging the information, of skills of knowing how to use what the modern world had to offer in terms of dissemination of information. And I think with these skills and with this baggage, this constituency arrived in 2011, and we know what happened, and they were able to use these skills for the protests. Now, it may be true, and I would not disagree with what Boris was talking about, that in fact the regime never changed, and we can find traces of the same instincts and traces, same factors, as far back as 2002 or maybe even 2001. But we didn't have the social modernization. That was new. And I think we may look at and we may actually mourn the decline of activism and the way the regime responded, but I don't think it's entirely gone. And what we are dealing with today, and the fact that Regina started with saying it's weak but still strong, right? And there's certainly a lot for scholars like yourselves to look at. I don't believe that social modernization can be fully destroyed. I think it probably can be, but it takes a cultural revolution, China style, not the kind of regime that we are having today. It is a very interesting question of where all these people are, and I mean, is there a chance, is there a reason to hope for a resurgence? And I don't think anybody has an answer for that, and there are different theories, and I will use this opportunity to advertise my new publication a little bit. Kirill Rogov's piece in my journal that will appear very soon is exactly about this, and I think what he offers as an explanation is original, and I haven't seen it anybody else. And I will keep you intrigued. Please read my journal. I think that we should, because I don't believe opposition is a good term. I think it describes only a small part of it. Two factors that we should look at: permissiveness of the government, which plays a huge role, and broad public demand. Because when at the peak of the protests, of course, the numbers in the streets were still very low by the standards of Russia, with its 140 million people. But the number of people who sympathized was about 1/3. People who sympathized with Russia without Putin. And that's quite something. But then, of course, it didn't last. And we had, if we summarize, anyway, from Putin, who had over 80% at the time of relative prosperity, being Putin the uniter, by actually enabling the nation to be relaxed. Let's put it this way. Then he became Putin the divider, when his approval rating went down to 60%. And then he became, again, Putin the uniter with over 80%. Now, do we go from here to Putin the divider again? If we do, it will be a different story, different from the previous stage, because those 60 plus were the result of permissiveness, and there's no chance of new permissiveness anytime soon. So if we go from here to this opposition, or whatever you call it, getting more active. I think the foundation for it, the factors will be different. And there is certainly the factor of the public demand, which we should not underestimate. 1/3 of the population saying in public opinion polls that we share the line Russia without Putin means demand. We don't have it now. And this is something that should not be underestimated. In this broad realm, which we can call opposition or however, we should differentiate between opinion, or the opinion that we can actually see in public opinion polls, the desire to express yourself in any way, activism, and the ability to reach out to broader public. I think this is a continuum of sorts. The difference in opinion is still there. And we see this. I think, Sam, you were talking about the perception of various government's initiatives and legislative and otherwise, anti-gay legislation, if I'm allowed the informal description, the ban and adoption of Russian orphans abroad, and the anti-Magnitsky law. The immediate perception was different. The anti-gay was immediately met with broadest possible approval. The Magnitsky Act, not the anti-Magnitsky Act, but the Magnitsky Act, I think many of you should remember, people regard it as positive development, as America helping Russians to fight their corrupt officials. It is hard to believe these days, but this was true. And the ban on adoption was not only received differently by different groups of Russian society, but this was a unique occasion in Russia when Putin had to face unfriendly questions. And a series of them, one reporter after another at his gala press conference was asking the same question, and the questions were unfriendly. So, and of course, even educated urbanites with time accepted both the ban on adoption and came to regard the Magnitsky Act totally differently. And there emerged a unanimity. But right now, just these days, the extermination of food evoked the difference in opinion. And so did the release on parole of Vasilyeva, who barely spent 1 month in custody and was released. So the difference in opinion is there even today with 80 plus. It does not, it cannot express itself in anything that's action because of the lack of permissiveness and because of, okay, yeah, I'll finish right now. And because the demand is very limited. And finally, I will, I have two questions to two factors that Graeme was talking about. One is patriotism, the other is agreeability. Patriotism I have a problem with how you, not with how you define patriotism, but the kind of questions you cite that you ask people to elicit patriots as opposed to non-patriots. And they were, in my view, very straightforward questions. Do you associate with Russian culture, Russian state, Russian something? There were 3 or 4, right? I think there could be, these are all almost it's almost the definition. Of course, if you are Russian, and the church, right? It was also the church. I think these are 2 obvious questions. And it's almost incorrect to say I am Russian, but I do not associate with Orthodox religion, and I do not associate with Russian culture. The state is a different issue. I think it would be very interesting to elicit in your questions how people view patriotic as opposed to not patriotic. And I think this is something to think about. And agreeability, I think it would be very interesting to discuss just what the word actually means in English. Is it the opposite of a conflicting personality who likes conflict? Because frankly, I don't see much difference between agreeability as you describe it and acquiescence. Agreeable people who like unanimity draw on the government to condemn, suppress, deport, and do things that are not agreeable at all. Or maybe I misunderstand the word. So I would be really interested to hear what you're saying.
Okay, thank you. So we have some time for questions. What I propose is just to take as many questions from the audience as we have time for, and then we'll turn to the panelists for a set of responses before we conclude. Yes, Sufjan, if you could just identify yourself, please.
Sufjan from University. I have a question for Regina. I really like the approach because all I hear from Russia is so depressing. But you see there's a positive thing, and this opposition you see not just a marginalized group, but as a political force. So my question.
Thank you. So my question is, when you describe opposition that participated in this local elections and may participate in federal elections as a positive force and as a political force, could you could you expand more a little bit about the domestic political impact of this opposition and on the impact of opposition on foreign policy of contemporary regime? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yes?
Do we have time for comments as well?
I think if they're very brief, maybe 1 minute. So we can wait for the microphone here.
Nikolai Petrov. Well, first of all, could you please tell what's the status of your 50 plus something pages report? Should it be published in full, or it will be a book, or?
Both.
Oh, okay, well, I'll start with saying that I do like this very much, and I'm not satisfied with the whole bunch of numerous publications on protests because they do not draw the picture precisely. It's simplistic, and in your piece, the historic part is simplistic as well. There are two major actors, the Kremlin and society. And there are two other very important actors which are not described, political elites and regional elites, first of all, and observers. And without observers, there would be no protest, because in Russia, and this is another mistake, here at the West, perception is that Russians did protest against bad or fraudulent elections. Elections do not play any role, and nobody would protest against elections. If only there would be not so numerous observers, and if only they would not feel humiliated by how they were treated, then protest would be absent. And Putin is absolutely right when he is trying to push out observers, and any elections, and recent elections in a year from now, would not cause any essential protest. So the second thing, and I'll be brief, is that I think you are very positive with regard to Russian society, and you do describe that this is situational and everything can change in a very short while. I think Russian society is drunk, and it's not that easy to keep it in this capacity, but not only it's drunk, it's poisoned. And what we can describe as a result of Weimar syndrome is the origin of another Weimar syndrome for the next generation. And when Putin is over, Russian society will remain not that good as it used to be before protests, but much worse. And it will take decades before society will become capable to do something. So my last question is to all participants, how do you see scenarios in which protests can either take place in near future or what will happen to them? Thank you.
Good. Other comments, questions? All right. So I think we have 5 presenters and about 14, maybe 15 minutes you could squeeze. So I think if you could try to keep your remarks. I know there's a lot to address, to 3 minutes each or less. I guess we could just. Okay. Well, aim for 3. We can give you a couple more if you want. So maybe we'll start with Regina and then go to Sam and Graeme, and we'll give our commentators some time to respond as well.
So I think it's a sad day when we say the presence of an opposition. And here I agree, the term is a very variegated set of actors. So you have some organization, and I would argue, and hopefully we'll talk about this, that organization does matter somewhat. Right, so who actually frames is an important question, right? To me, it's an important question. Who coordinated observers is an extraordinarily important question. So organization does matter, and very small organizations sometimes matter. Not, Sufyan, because they are politically relevant right now, but because they're relevant in the sense that they are providing the only information, the only alternative source of information, and that different sources of information and different actions provide very different touchstones, right? So we say this word political trust all the time, but really political trust means something very precise. It means that I trust my leader to act in my interest, right? And observers let us know that the leaders weren't acting in their interest. In fact, they were taking their power. So you can start to think a little bit across issue areas of when it's easier or less easy to perceive the leader as acting in your interest, right? When the leader is destroying food, the leader's not acting at your interest, and there was no lack of very quick response despite an information dearth, right? And so I think we need to think more precisely about what it means in that context. So I would say that they have very little direct political relevance at the moment, but that doesn't mean that they're not an important actor in shaping things like coordinating these civic organizations and linking them together, in creating common political frames, and in trying to shift again or reclaim the agenda from sort of a Putin-friendly agenda to a Putin non-friendly agenda, to refocus on the economy. They have almost zero influence at the moment on foreign policy. I'm not sure, and presumably other people will talk about it, but I think almost no one has any influence over foreign policy. But let me just say one thing about a small disagreement that maybe Graeme and Sam and I have, which is just like these attitudes or personalities, just like politics are co-created, so are these attitudes and personalities, or at least the trends or the way they manifest. So you're polling at exactly the moment that the Kremlin moves very aggressively to use things like moral panic to define in and out groups and to circumscribe acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And so it's not only the receptivity of it, but the new toolkit, the new authoritarian toolkit, is really using symbolic politics and these symbolic ideas to circumscribe political behavior and speech. And I think that's really clear, and people are in part responding to that. Or at least that's what we see.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, Sam.
So I'll start by saying that I think that's exactly right. And I think that it's mutual construction. It's construction of societal reaction, and it's construction of regime reaction, and it's iterative. So it's constantly being produced and reproduced. And I think at the end of the day, Masha, to your question, right, is opposition the best term to use? And may our grant givers forgive us, since it's in the title of the grant, but at the end of the day, I think opposition isn't actually what we're writing about. It's about contestation. That you very clearly have a regime that has certain goals it's trying to achieve, right, and is finding its way towards the achievement of those goals, and you've got a society that has both a certain amount of desire for and a certain amount of capacity for resistance, rather you've got citizens that have a certain amount of capacity and desire for resistance, and they look for strategies of coping with that, and there are many different ways that can happen. So I think that when we look at the very micro level story having to do with personalities and emotions and things, that we're looking at what's happening on the level, as close as we can get to it, of an individual in a person's mind, right? And then there's the question of how does that then get aggregated at the level of a collective response? How does then the state shape the landscape for collective response? And also provide political opportunity structures, and this gets into things like that Nikolai was talking about in terms of elites and a much more complex picture of actors, and I agree that we need to make that more problematic. I think there are a couple of other just brief things I would say. Masha, you were talking about social modernization, and you can probably predict what I'm going to say, but I've written before about individual modernization. Graeme and I haven't discussed this, so I don't know whether we agree. But I tend to think that what you described in the Medvedev period was a period in which individuals were modernizing, right? And so individuals were going out in what was still a very atomized social structure, right? And getting involved in the internet, traveling, in some cases, right, getting jobs in something like a high-tech sector, right, or an internet cluster in Moscow, but it was never big enough to create the kinds of of reinforcing social effects that Silicon Valley creates, or that kind of thing that you have around here. Now, it takes time, right? But I think it's not quite the same thing to say that, yes, the creation of a cohort of modernized individuals brings modernized forms and practices into society, but that's not the same thing necessarily as social modernization. That it allows for the introduction of these kinds of things, like the response to the forest fires, right, which throws down a challenge to other citizens, right, which throws down a challenge to the regime to a certain extent. But it's not to say that this becomes even necessarily a self-reproducing form in Russia. And when we've seen the recent fires around Baikal, for example, look at the health map. It's not there, right? It's not happening again. Well, that may be an issue, right? But that is not projected as easily as the frames and the ideas of resistance.